for joining us this evening as our kind of guest speaker. Tell us about your background in farming then. Is this something, have you always been involved in farming?
Yeah, I guess, well, yes and no. My parents weren't farmers, but my mum's dad was. They had a farm, a dairy farm, that was sold before I was born, just before I was born. And my dad was an agricultural engineer, so very farming linked. And it's one of these things you get asked as a child. You go around to you see a 5-year-old and say, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I've always wanted to be a farmer, but unfortunately, with my mum and dad not being born to landed gentry, I've had to work for other farmers for my living. So I did a degree in agriculture at Reading back in 1986. I graduated, and then spent about 15 years in farm management, running other people's farms, and I was included a pick your own near Oxford. I'm from down south originally, to answer one of your questions that was raised just now. I've lived in Yorkshire since 1991, so I think, since 1989, sorry, so I think I'm probably lived here longer than not in Yorkshire, but I'm still not a local, obviously. Yeah, I was around a pick your own near Oxford, and then moved to Yorkshire, and ended up 6 years running Newby Hall Estate on a farm there as their farm manager in the mid-90s. We were growing a wide range of crops, plus had a flock of sheep. I then got involved with a local organic farmer at Boroughbridge, and that business grew over sort of a 10-year period. We were growing about 400 acres of organic veg across North Yorkshire, mainly carrots and potatoes, but a lot of other things as well. And we had a pack house, and we were supplying local people. We supplied Riverford, we supplied Booth supermarkets, we supplied the school fruit and vegetable scheme, doing various things. And the farm owner had some various changes of land and things went on in 2009, and I took over the packing side of that business, set up a pack house, got involved with some veg packing and processing, and then as a sideline to that, I was doing advisory work, and I was advising growing sweet corn in North Yorkshire, growing garlic in Bulgaria, and anyway, that business closed. We just financially couldn't carry on. It was sort of, the vegetable industry is driven down by supermarket pricing, and nobody's allowed to make any money, so we stopped packing then. And I started working, we did mainly organic through that business, and I started working for the Soil Association. I worked for 7 years for the Soil Association as a full-time inspector, covering from field to fork, across England, across the UK, and into Europe as well, carrying out inspections. Also under Soil Association, we also did red tractor inspections, various other bits and pieces. I've left SA in middle of last year, this time last year, to go set up my own business, going contracted. So I still do some contracted inspections for the Soil Association. I also carrying out Soil Association Exchange farm sustainability assessments, which is a new project that the charity side of the Soil Association started 2 years ago or 18 months ago, and that's measuring the sustainability of a farm, which is which is all where this ties in really well. So I think I've done about 30 farms so far since October. And tonight, what I was going to try and do was do some real life examples of what the emissions are on farms. And these aren't academic texts, these aren't anything else, but they are actual real life examples, just to sort of highlight some points to talk about, really. So yeah, and I also, so my partner is Rachel Gibson, Breezegarth Farm, and so they're an organic, long-standing organic dairy and cereal farm, and we.
So they're up, is it Gillamore, Spawnton? Sort
yeah, it's Gillamore. Yeah, we're Gillamore. Yeah, and we're doing pasteurised unhomogenized milk from the farm, as well as supplying organic milk suppliers co-op.
Okay.
That farm's been organic for over 20 years, nearly 25 years. Started by her dad, and now basically is run by Rachel and her sister Ruth, with her dad sort of helping out as well. And between them, they run the farm. It's a small farm. We've got 50 cows, so in terms of dairy farms, very small. That's things go now. So I help out on that.
Quite a rich background there. So it sounds like we're in good hands anyway. With
yeah, and then just to cap it all, I'm also growing woad, which is a very old English crop for indigo.
Right. Okay. Right.
Which is another part of my the last couple of years. I got involved with fibres and flax growing and natural dye growing. So we're growing about an acre of woad this year.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
So I've got sort of lots of fingers in lots of pies and doing various other things as well. It's a very long list actually. I realise it's probably too long. So I've been involved, and so I see quite a breadth of industry. And with the inspection side of my work, we go in from the sort of tabletop processing licensees right through to the largest companies. Go through abattoirs, go through processors and farms as well, from the smallest farms to the largest farms. So I've seen a lot of food chain, food supply industry, which generally is obviously predicated around supermarket supply in the UK. Not so much with organic maybe, but lots of the big companies, they do a little bit of organic because the supermarket they supply, 99% is not organic, and they want to do the organic to make it get the contract sort of thing. Okay. So a lot of my background has been looking at the supermarket supply chain and what they expect, and the problems that causes and the issues that causes. So I think so I sort of see the whole industry, and I think for me that's one of the things. There's a lot talked about sustainable food production and what we should eat, we shouldn't eat. Meat is bad. You see all sorts of fallacies about the methane production from cattle, and all the other things. And then I think farmers do sometimes feel they're pilloried in the press. It's an easy win, and I think that's one of my concerns as well, is that we're quite possibly being led astray by vested interest in many ways to make figures fit. And the more I look at what's going on, the more we look at measuring sustainability, measuring the farm the carbon footprints of farms. We see that there are lots of ways of doing things. So Paul, I think it'd be a good point to stop listening to me waffling on and watch the film, because it's a far nicer film than I.
Yeah, sure. So the format's going to be that there's a short video. It's only I think a couple of minutes, no more than that. A bit of content there about soil, and then it'd be great if you could share a few case studies with us. We've said all along between Mark and myself that there's going to be probably too much to do in an hour here, but Mark has very kindly offered to come back probably after the summer for part 2. And I think in terms of, for once we've had a few examples, and we'll go to questions and discussion with the whole group, you'll very much be led by you as to where we spend the rest of that time and what your questions are, and where you want to take the discussion after that. And I'm sure we won't cover everything, but as I say, there is a chance to come back for part 2, hopefully in September. There's a little video here. If I just share the screen, it should be okay. And just a bit of context here. This is something you might want to look up. There's an online program called Couch to Carbon Zero. There's a group of about 30 of us doing it in Pickering at the moment. Basically, you get one short video every day for 10 days. It's free. You just sign up, and then it covers all sorts of stuff we can do to help the environment in short, bite-sized bits using some natty little videos. And surprise, the one that I got yesterday was on farming, or on soil anyway. So I thought, right, we'll show a little bit of this, because this kind of, I guess, summarizes probably what most of us know anyway, but a good recap on some of the challenges that we're facing with farming. So hopefully this is going to play. Just shout if it's not working or you can't hear it, and I'll start the video.
So we've inhabited the world of money and energy and apps and symbols. And now we turn our attention to something altogether more real, more touchable, more elemental, literally coming down to earth. More specifically, the ground beneath our feet. Soil. Turns out that soil may just have the power to save us all. And out of all the things we've discovered, what we learnt about soil is the one that blew us away the most. Did you know it's alive, just teeming with life? There are more soil microorganisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on Earth. It's kind of a mind-blowing network of micro and macro bugs. And because of them, soil has got this immense ability to absorb greenhouse gases. It's what feeds the plants, which feed all life. It replenishes our freshwater supplies and rebalances our climate. Pretty, splendid stuff. But most of the Earth is no longer covered in soil. Our soil is dying, and it's turning into a gritty, sandy, four-letter word called dirt. And it means the planet is turning into a desert. It's no joke. Dirt can't do any of the things soil can. And instead of plentiful food and lushness, we have threatened food supplies, droughts and flooding, leading us towards a Mad Max type scenario. How on earth has this happened? Well, industrial agriculture, mainly to feed the animals that feed us, has taken over our land. It rips up the soil and those intricate underlying systems. All that carbon that was so beautifully locked into it gets released into the atmosphere. Add to that the staggering use of pesticides and artificial fertilizers over decades and decades, and planting the same crops over and over, and there we have it. Imagine if someone did that to you, sprayed you with pesticides, fed you nothing but chemicals, dug you out every time you built a home, and did it over and over again. Well, there'd be nothing left of any of us, and that's basically what's happened. So we need to bring it back to life and stop doing the things that kill it. Now, wouldn't that be a beautiful mission? So what do? Aside from our diet, the cardinal rule of thumb is not to waste our food at all. So all that destruction hasn't been for nothing. The second is to give pesticides the marching orders, both at the supermarket and in our own backyards. So if you can afford to, buy organic, even just some of the time. By choosing that organic beetroot, we are directly helping heal the planet, even ourselves actually. How cool is that? Now to our gardens, if we have one. Check your shed and get rid of any...
I'll stop it there because we're moving more to gardens rather than farming. But that's a good kind of a summary of the issues we're maybe familiar with anyway, but a good recap. So maybe if you share a few kind of examples with us, Mark, some case studies to give us a bit more context, that would be great.
Yeah, so it sort of sums up what I was going to say, Paul, to be fair. So it is a really good thing in a nutshell. So where do you start really with this? Because it's a huge topic and it gets very nuanced. It gets very, very detailed, very, very technical in terms of there isn't a simple single message that you should take away. I think the more farms I visit and you look at in detail at the sustainability of it, at the soil testing and the biodiversity and all the other things we look at, there is no single magic bullet. And farms are good or bad individually. So I sort of been puzzling over how to sort of work through this talk and see where we go with it, because I think what we need to recognize is that we need resilient farmers for a start, because without farmers, you have to remember the rule of three. Basically, we have 3 minutes, 3 days, and 3 weeks. 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And if we forget that, we're in a very dangerous position, on an island with 70 million people. Because if we're struggling with that, then every other country in the world will be, which is you know, and I do worry about that because, and I'm not a believer in the fact that food supply needs to keep growing either to meet the population growth. I think there's a lot of fallacy about that sort of red herring as well. But I just am conscious that we need to have that food in front of people, because otherwise, you know, life is very unpleasant, to say the least. So I think we do need to shift our farming landscape, how we farm. I do strongly believe that we should have an organic-based future, or a future that is based around regenerative principles, whatever that means. And that's another whole conversation, really, because again, people throw about these words, and it can mean whatever it wants it to mean. At least organic has a legal status. It means what it says it means. If I'm a regenerative farmer, you could be a regenerative farmer, Paul, and you could be doing something totally different and using lots of pesticides, lots of fertilizers, and still call yourself regenerative, and it doesn't mean anything. So I think we do need to have that conversation. We do, I think, need to be eating less but better meat. You know, we do. Livestock production is integral to the fertility of farms, in terms of, you know, it's easy for people to say, oh, well, we can use wood chip to grow our vegetables, or we can, you know, we have vegetables, we can grow organic vegetables, but to grow organic vegetables, you need to have a 2-year fertility building phase, which is grass clover or a clover type lay. You know, so we have grass fields in that basis to grow your vegetables. The amount of wood chip we need to produce a fertility on farms, on large areas we need to supply the vegetables for 70 million people, will be phenomenal. You know, we'd end up cutting down half the forests in England to actually produce the wood chip. It works on specific scale, on specific areas. If you have a small area of woodland, I'm not trying to digress, I'm just saying that everything is different and everything in its place. I think that what does concern me is the way that everything is made to seem to be simple. A farmer should do this, do that, and it will solve the problems. It is not as simple as that, and I think we have to recognise the responsibilities within the supply chain as well. That actually, you know, bearing in mind 90% or something of our food goes through supermarkets, and basically the way they play their customers to eat a lot of ultra processed food that is actually not basically required. And I think if you go into a supermarket, if anybody, you know, I try not to, I use the Co-op in Kirby because I do, but you need to go down to, one of the large big 4 supermarkets, you need to go down 3 lines probably. You don't need to go down the other 15 lines, because actually that's not food you need. And I think that is another realization we should be making, is actually our diets. We have a responsibility for our diets, and the linking of diets and obesity and the health problems that we get from food is directly linked to you know, huge costs in the NHS. That all linkages are together, and how we produce, how we think about the food. And I'm just reinventing this. If you go back to there was a project at the end of the war in London, I forget the name of it now, that was looking at bringing healthy food to people at that point in time, trying to get rid of white bread and reintroducing wholemeal bread. You go back to the likes of Albert Howard, you go back to the likes of William Cobbett, they were all talking about food and diet. All great campaigners of 200 or 300 years ago. So this conversation has been going on for a long time. And sadly, we seem to be really bad at it here. So sort of just as a discussion point, because we can talk about how you do all sorts of things, and I think we can really, I would like to open it out actually, and what I would like to do with what we're going to just give you a few examples of farms that I've done recently, have had their sort of sustainability measure, and this is just their carbon outputs on their farms to give people an idea of what it looks like. So I great fan of PowerPoint. So I've got a short PowerPoint because it's easier to put them on there as a there. There we are. So basically, I've got 4 farms, and this shows you the ignore the bit at the bottom. That has actually I've copied this off farm schools. I wanted them to be anonymous, but basically you can see this farm here. It's farm number 1. The CO2 emissions, diesel, basically red diesel use on the tractors, nearly 1,000 tons. Building materials, 500 tons. Tractors and machinery, which isn't a great deal. Crops. Now, some people never realise actually just the action of a plant growing, it's actually growing, produces emissions. So the crop growing there, 660. Oh, that does. Sorry, that does. That crop one there does include fertilizer as well. But there are you do actually get emissions from plants just from growing. About 10% of that 660 tons is just the way that the plant grows and emits nitrogen, emits CO2. I know it takes it in, but it emits it as well. And then when it dies, it rots down. And so it does an emission, but that crop's there. So that farm basically, with the crops and then with the inputs, and the inputs include fertilizer and pesticides, that farm produces 5,000 tons of CO2 a year. Now, so I'll just put that in, and the offsets. So this is where it gets you're absorbing CO2. They absorb 400 tons. So their net is sort of 4,700 tons. And you can see things like field margins, hedgerows, and a bit of woodland. This is farm number 2. And here, again, you see fuel is not that great, cropping is not that great, inputs, and here 3,800 tons is livestock. I'll sort of open this out a bit in shortly. So you can see there's a farm there again producing 4,600 tons of CO2, sequestering very little. The farm here, this is a slightly different one. You notice the fuels are quite high. Most of the emissions are from fuel. The cropping, the actual growing of the crops is also a little bit there. Inputs, it's hardly anything. Which is an interesting figure. So how come they're growing crops with no inputs, and the first farm was growing a lot of crops but had a high number of inputs? And again, you see a bit of sequestration there, but not huge amounts. And then the last farm, which it looks slightly different. The fuels are down quite a lot. Cropping and the inputs are relatively low. They're not quite as high. Now, this is an arable farm as well, to give you a clue. And they've got a bit of sequestration as well, not a huge amount. So the woodland a little bit. And these are annual figures, by the way. So this will be what the farm will produce on an annual basis. So just as hopefully I'm coming back now. Some point. Can you hear me, Paul?
Yeah, we lost the screen, but we can hear you.
I'm back now. Yeah, so I've got quite a dodgy internet connection, as I guess most people in Red are. Right. So those 4 farms there, I sort of just put them out there so you can see the difference. And they're all in the north of England, or basically in the north of England. And actually, sorry, they're not all in North England, but they're all of different farms. So you can see the difference there between what they do. And one of the interesting things is most of the sequestration there is fairly low. What that doesn't cover is what's sequestered in the soil, by the way, which could be a different figure altogether on some of them. Now, just to let you sort of think about this one. So the first farm where they had 5,000 tons was a North Lincolnshire, 5,000 acre North Lincolnshire, very, very intensively run arable estate, basically. High input, it had very high output, but it had very high input. And you can see there that the effects. The second farm with the high output was a very intensive dairy unit over in Cumbria. I think they had something like 300 cows, indoor housed, 3,500 tons of emissions, but the other were fairly low. The third farm, where there was no inputs or very low inputs, was actually an organic farm in the southwest, growing a lot of veg in polytunnels, I think, down there. Hence the fertility was natural fertility they were using rather than fertilizers. And the fourth farm was probably one of the leading examples of a regenerative farm in the UK, that still was using lots of fertilizer, or quite a lot of fertilizer, but you could see things like diesel use were down. So it gives you, that's just a snapshot. I can come back to them if people want to talk about it or ask questions about those specific farms, but it just shows the breadth of the conversation that goes on. And so I think, for me, I think actually the really interesting thing about the small film you showed, actually the reason I quite liked it was the fact it said, do not waste food. Because actually 30% of their food is wasted before it goes between the farm and the customer. Now, some of that is probably inedible parts that you can't eat, but there's still a huge amount of loss and waste. You know, how would you feel if, you know, anybody watching, you know, in this meeting tonight did their job and suddenly, you know, you produce something or you do something and somebody picks it up and throws 30% of it away before you even get to finish it, really effectively. You know, most people will be heartbroken with farming, you know, in the food production. It's like, oh, it's fine. You know, there's plenty more where that comes from. And sort of I'm not really, I don't think I'm answering the, you know, the sort of the challenge you set me. I feel that I felt I couldn't answer it because actually I think it's so complex that to give an answer would be unfair to the question. And I really want to generate some conversation because I think helping people understand or being challenged by what I've said is probably more beneficial than actually just saying this is what we should do, because it's not necessarily as clear. An interesting examples are, I mean, Riverford, the Vegbox people, their social media activity is excellent in terms of trying to explain what goes on in the food supply chain and how they think about it. And they study things, you know, they say, is it, you know, they bring tomatoes in from southern Spain. And actually, at certain points of the year, it's better to bring tomatoes in terms of carbon footprint than it is to grow them in Devon. They're actually getting to the stage now where they're sort of, there are bigger recognition coming on, and they're starting to think, well, actually, should we bring tomatoes in from southern Spain because of the water issues in Spain and the potential labour abuses there are in Spain? It depends on how far you want to go, you know, and most suppliers pay lip service to that, but actually don't really care, you know, in terms of the multiple suppliers. So I think if people want to see, you know, the dilemmas that the whole supply chain and the Riverford, because they're a connected supply chain and they're 100% owned by their employees, so they are very egalitarian in their outlook. If, you know, follow Riverford on social media because they explain a huge amount of why costs are what they are. You know, the recent post that Guy Watson put out was saying, you know, they had put their prices up 5%. He says, you know, the price, the wages they're paying their field staff and they've gone up 20% in the last 2 years. And he said, that's great, but somebody's got to pay for it. You know, and actually it's the consumer that has to pay. If you talk to supermarkets about that, and I can give you some examples of conversations, oh, thanks, Paul, conversations that, you know, have been had with supermarket buyers, especially around vegetables, you know, it will be appalling. I've got plenty of examples of you know, what their view on the world is.
Can I come in there a second? Are you seeing any shift in more people willing to pay a bit more, especially if it's organic. Mark, is that changing at all?
I think it is, and I think it's interesting going around businesses doing inspections. You know, the businesses I knew before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Yeah, I can understand that, Linda. I can. You see, you know, that you go to business like local veg box schemes. And growers that have, you know, maybe got 5 or 6 acres, and they buy some fruit and veg in, and then they sell veg boxes, you know, and they say during the pandemic everything went manic for the first 6 months of the pandemic, and it then dropped back a bit, and into the second year they were saying, oh well, that's it, it's gonna go, you know, and I think it didn't. And interestingly, the majority of the people I go and see are saying that actually their business doubled between pandemic and now. And so they are still holding in there, and they say, you know, well, actually it's done. It means I'm now making a little bit of money. I can afford to employ another person and have another. It takes a bit of pressure off all the other staff that were having to work really hard. And so the pandemic did have an effect, and I think people recognise the requirements, the resilience actually, and the fact that local food, which can be more expensive, only because you've not got all the hidden costs in there that society pays actually.
Yes.
And I think
there's a difference between price and cost, isn't there? Price is one thing, but what it's actually costing in the wider picture is something we often never know. And
so I do think that there is a huge, socio-economic aspect to this. I understand, you know, electricity prices, energy prices going up, and it has caused, you know, huge hardship for people. But I do get fumingly that's the wrong word, frustrated when, you know, you go and read the Guardian and they say, oh, food inflation, you know, and what's the highest inflationary, you know, a litre of milk has gone up from £1 to £1.25, so 25% increase in inflation, you know, 25% increase in price or whatever. But nobody mentions the fact that nobody can afford to live in a house, you know, and they don't, you know, everybody's talking, the government's supposed to be talking to the supermarkets to say, keep your food inflation down. And yet nobody's talking to house builders saying, keep your house prices down, and not £50,000 or £100,000 off the price of a house, which actually, given 30 or 40% of people's income, and in some people's income, 50% of their income is spent on housing, you know, and they spend as little on food because they've got such little discretionary spend, which has its own knock-on effect. Sorry, I'm getting my sort of, but I think the whole thing is
it's quite complex.
Yeah.
Would you have any advice if people are maybe already buying a bit of organic or toying with the idea of buying more organic food? The pros and cons of, you know, if I go and buy organic food from the Co-op or Lidl or Morrison's or whatever versus you know, from a local farm, you know, that sells it produced directly. You know, maybe some obvious things there, but again, I think anything's that obvious perhaps in this space. So what would you say about that kind of comparison, where we should buy our organic produce?
I think, I mean, there was work done back in the early 2000s, looking at the multiplier effect, it's called, and where you should spend your money. And if you spend it locally, it has a 3-fold multiplier on the local economy. So if you go to Newfields Farm Shop and buy your veg there, and the veg there is the same price or cheaper than it is anywhere else, it's the packing rate. So you buy a kilo of carrots at Lidl, and I actually got to Lidl last week. because they got some great tools in Lidl. Anyway, that's beside the point. But I went to Lidl in Pickering, and you know, they were selling carrots 95p a bag. Well, that sounds good. John at Newfield sells carrots at £1.25 a kilo. The bag at Lidl was 750 grams. So actually, it's more expensive. You can go and buy carrots that were dug the same day from Newfields, and they will last. They will last, 3 or 4 times as long. They'll be dirty, and you keep them dirty and wash them when you need them. They'll last 2 weeks in your fridge, 3 weeks in your fridge. No plastic packaging, and it is what it is. But you get this local multiplier. I would say, if ever you can, buy from local producers. There are 1 or 2 other shops that will selling organic, and that's fine. Obviously we can't grow bananas in Yorkshire, we can't grow oranges, so if you want bananas and oranges, then you can.
Might do soon in this weather, you never know.
Well, yeah. But so you have to do that. And in terms of what should you, I would say you should just, and the other thing is eat in season. That's one of the key things. It's interesting, in that film there was a quick shot of empty supermarket shelves. Interestingly, when you talk to supermarket suppliers now, supermarkets are happy to have empty shelves. Used to be, if you didn't supply a supermarket, the fine they would fine you would be extortionate, and you never let them down, because if you did, it cost you a lot of money, and you'd be in danger of losing your contract as a supplier. Now the supermarkets aren't worried about having empty shelves. Now they obviously got their reasons for that, and one of the reasons is probably they say, well, get people used to it, I think, is one of the things. And it's across all the supermarkets, and if you go into any of them now, you'll see empty shelves. And I think it's a change in expectation. I think there are other things playing there as well, which I wouldn't at all surprise me, how they're thinking. But I would say just eat seasonally, eat locally as best you can, and you will find generally it is of the best quality. And if it's a bit more expensive in terms of meats, then eat less. Spend the same amount of money as you would, but eat less. Better quality but less.